Poor maid takes daughter to work, freaks out when she calls her billionaire boss her dad. The pre-dawn darkness of Chicago wrapped around Maria Rodriguez like a heavy blanket as she clutched her sleeping daughter closer to her chest. At 28, Maria had already lived through more heartbreak than most people experienced in a lifetime. Her weathered hands, roughened by years of scrubbing floors and polishing marble countertops, gently adjusted the thin blanket around 2-year-old Sophia's tiny form. Today was different. Today was terrifying. Her usual babysitter, Mrs. Chen from downstairs, had called at 5 in the morning with pneumonia. The backup sitter was out of town. Maria had scrolled through her phone with trembling fingers, calling every name in her limited contacts list, but it was too early, too sudden, too much to ask. She stared at her phone screen, watching the minutes tick closer to 6 o'clock, the time she needed to leave to make it to the Thornfield estate by 7. Missing work wasn't an option. She'd already missed 2 days last month when Sophia had the flu, and Mrs. Patterson, the head housekeeper, had made it crystal clear that another absence would mean termination. The cleaning service that employed Maria worked for dozens of wealthy clients across the city, and they had a waiting list of people desperate for these jobs. She was replaceable. Completely, utterly replaceable. But Sophia wasn't. Sophia was her entire world, her reason for breathing, her motivation for enduring 12-hour days on her feet. The little girl's father had disappeared the moment Maria told him she was pregnant, leaving her with nothing but broken promises and unpaid rent. Maria's own family was back in Texas, struggling themselves, unable to offer more than prayers and occasional phone calls. She looked down at her daughter's peaceful face, those long dark lashes resting against round cheeks, the tiny mouth slightly open in deep sleep. How could something so perfect, so innocent, have come from such chaos? The decision made itself, really. Maria couldn't afford to lose this job. The Thornfield estate was her biggest client, the one that paid almost half her monthly income for just 2 days of work each week. The owner, Alexander Thornfield, was allegedly worth billions, though Maria had only seen him a handful of times in the 8 months she'd worked there. He was like a ghost haunting his own mansion, appearing in hallways unexpectedly, his cold gray eyes passing over her as if she were part of the furniture. Maria quickly packed Sophia's diaper bag with practiced efficiency: diapers, wipes, change of clothes, sippy cup, snacks, and the worn stuffed elephant that Sophia couldn't sleep without. She added coloring books and crayons, anything to keep a toddler quiet and occupied. Then she dressed her still sleeping daughter in warm clothes and carried her down 3 flights of stairs to the street where she'd catch the first bus of the morning. The bus ride took an hour and 15 minutes, traveling from her modest neighborhood on the south side to the exclusive suburb of Winnetka, where mansions hid behind gates and perfectly manicured hedges. Sophia woke up halfway through the journey, confused and cranky, her little face scrunching up as she looked around the unfamiliar bus. "Mama home?" she asked, her voice that precious mixture of baby talk and real words. "Not yet, sweetheart," Maria whispered, kissing her forehead. "Mama has to go to work today, and you're going to be so good for me, right? You're going to play very quietly." Sophia nodded, though Maria doubted the little girl understood the gravity of the situation. 2-year-olds didn't understand bills and eviction notices. They didn't understand that the difference between eating and going hungry often came down to a single paycheck. As the bus pulled closer to the Thornfield estate, Maria's anxiety ratcheted higher. She mentally reviewed the mansion's layout, calculating which rooms she could put Sophia in while she cleaned others. The estate had 12 bedrooms, 15 bathrooms, a library, a ballroom, 3 living areas, and a kitchen bigger than Maria's entire apartment. Surely in all that space, she could find somewhere safe for Sophia to play while staying far away from Alexander Thornfield. The man was legendary among the household staff for his cold demeanor and rigid expectations. He'd made his fortune in tech, selling his company for an astronomical sum before he turned 35, and now at 40, he lived alone in this massive estate with just a handful of staff who came and went. No friends visited. No family appeared for holidays. Mrs. Patterson had once mentioned that Mr. Thornfield's parents had died in a car accident when he was in college, and he'd been alone ever since, growing harder and more isolated with each passing year. Maria had seen that hardness herself. Once, she'd accidentally been cleaning the study when he'd entered unexpectedly. She'd frozen, apologized profusely, and hurried to leave, but not before she'd caught the full force of that icy stare. His face was handsome in a severe way, sharp jawline, high cheekbones, dark hair always perfectly styled, but there was no warmth in it, no humanity. He'd simply waited in silence until she left, as if speaking to her would have been beneath him. The bus stopped a block from the estate's entrance. Maria gathered Sophia and all their belongings, her heart hammering against her ribs. The morning sun was just beginning to paint the sky in shades of pink and gold as she approached the service entrance at the back of the property. She had her own key code, as did all the regular staff. The kitchen was empty when they entered. The chef didn't arrive until 9 to prepare Mr. Thornfield's lunch. Maria quickly surveyed the space, then made a decision. She'd set Sophia up in the small sitting room adjacent to the kitchen, a cozy space with a sofa and television that the staff sometimes used during breaks. She could work in the nearby rooms and check on Sophia regularly. She settled her daughter on the sofa with her coloring books and a granola bar, turning on the television to a children's program with the volume low. Sophia seemed content, already absorbed in her coloring, her little tongue poking out in concentration as she scribbled with a purple crayon. "Mama will be right in there," Maria said, pointing to the dining room visible through the doorway. "You stay right here, okay? Very quiet. Like a mouse." Sophia nodded, her attention already back on her coloring book. Maria took a deep breath and began her work, moving through the rooms with the efficiency of long practice. Dust the surfaces, vacuum the floors, clean the windows, polish the fixtures. Every few minutes, she'd peek into the sitting room to check on Sophia, and each time, her daughter was exactly where she'd left her, being the good girl Maria had prayed she would be. For 2 glorious hours, everything went perfectly. Maria began to relax, to believe that maybe, just maybe, she would pull this off. She was finishing up the formal dining room, polishing the massive mahogany table until she could see her reflection in it, when she heard it. A child's laugh, bright and delighted, echoing from somewhere deeper in the house. Maria's blood turned to ice. She dropped her polishing cloth and ran toward the sound, her mind racing with catastrophic scenarios. Sophia must have wandered off. She must have gone exploring through this maze of a house. What if she'd broken something? What if she'd disturbed Mr. Thornfield? Maria rushed through the hallway, following the sound of her daughter's voice, and burst into the main study, a room she wasn't scheduled to clean until this afternoon, a room that Mr. Thornfield used as his personal office. The scene before her made time stop. Alexander Thornfield sat in his leather chair behind his massive desk, and perched on the edge of that desk, swinging her little legs and chattering away without a care in the world, was Sophia. Maria's world tilted on its axis as she stood frozen in the doorway of Alexander Thornfield's study. Her mind couldn't process what her eyes were seeing. Sophia, her precious baby girl, sat cross-legged on the massive mahogany desk belonging to the most intimidating man Maria had ever encountered, surrounded by what appeared to be important documents and a very expensive laptop. "Sophia!" Maria's voice came out as a strangled whisper, horror and panic fighting for dominance in her chest. Alexander Thornfield's head snapped up at the sound. Those cold gray eyes that had always passed over Maria as if she were invisible now fixed on her with laser-like intensity. She waited for the eruption, for the fury, for the words that would end her employment and possibly destroy her entire life. But the explosion never came. Instead, something shifted in Thornfield's expression, not softening exactly, but a subtle change that Maria couldn't quite identify. He'd been leaning back in his chair, and now she noticed what she'd initially missed. He was holding Sophia's stuffed elephant, the one with the frayed ear and missing button eye that her daughter couldn't sleep without. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he said, his voice as cold and measured as she remembered. "I assume this belongs to you." It wasn't a question. Maria's legs finally remembered how to work, and she rushed forward, her hands already reaching for her daughter. "Mr. Thornfield, I'm so sorry, I'm so incredibly sorry." The words tumbled out in a rush as she lifted Sophia off the desk, clutching her daughter close. "My babysitter got sick, and I couldn't find anyone else, and I thought I could keep her contained in the sitting room, and I'm so sorry. It won't happen again. I'll leave right now, I'll—" "Stop." The single word cut through her panic-fueled rambling like a knife. Maria's mouth snapped shut. She held Sophia tighter, feeling her daughter squirm in her arms. "Mama, down." Sophia protested, but Maria's grip didn't loosen. Thornfield stood from his chair, his 6'2" frame towering over them both. He was dressed in what Maria had learned was his standard home attire, expensive dark slacks and a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing surprisingly muscular forearms. She'd always assumed billionaires were soft, pampered, but Alexander Thornfield looked like he could hold his own in any situation. He studied them for a long moment, and Maria braced herself for dismissal, for anger, for anything. Instead, he rounded the desk and held out the stuffed elephant. "She came looking for this," he said simply. It had fallen behind the sofa in the sitting room. Sophia's face lit up. "Ella! Dada found Ella!" The silence that followed Sophia's words was deafening. Maria felt the blood drain from her face as her daughter's innocent declaration hung in the air between them. Of all the things Sophia could have said, of all the possible disasters Maria had imagined, this particular nightmare hadn't even occurred to her. "Sophia, no, sweetie, this isn't," Maria started, but Sophia was already reaching for the elephant with both hands. "Thank Dada," Sophia insisted, her 2-year-old logic apparently having decided that any man who retrieved her beloved Ella must automatically qualify for the highest title she knew. Maria wanted the floor to swallow her whole. She couldn't look at Thornfield, couldn't bear to see the disgust or anger or whatever emotion must be playing across that stone-cold face. "Mr. Thornfield, she doesn't understand, she's only 2, she doesn't have a father, and she's never—" Maria was babbling again, she knew it, but she couldn't seem to stop. "She just calls any man who's nice to her that. I'm so sorry, I'll explain to her, I'll—" "How old is she?" The question was so unexpected that Maria's frantic apologies died mid-sentence. She finally forced herself to meet Thornfield's gaze, searching for the contempt she expected to find there. But his expression was unreadable, those gray eyes fixed not on Maria but on Sophia, who was now cuddling her elephant and humming contentedly in her mother's arms. "She's 2, Maria answered quietly. "She'll be 3 in August." Thornfield nodded slowly, as if this information confirmed something he'd been calculating. The silence stretched out, broken only by Sophia's soft humming. "You're scheduled until 5 o'clock today," Thornfield said finally, his tone businesslike. "The library needs to be cleaned, it hasn't been touched in weeks. You can set up your daughter there while you work. There's a window seat with cushions. The door locks from the inside." Maria stared at him, certain she'd misheard. What? "The library," he repeated, with the patience of someone explaining something to a particularly slow student. "Second floor, east wing. Large room, lots of books, can't miss it. Your daughter can stay there while you complete your assigned tasks." He paused, then added, "There's a bathroom attached. And the chef will be preparing lunch around noon. I'll have him make extra." You're not firing me?" The question came out barely above a whisper. Something flickered in Thornfield's eyes, surprise, maybe, or possibly offense. "Why would I fire you? You've been one of the most reliable members of the household staff. Mrs. Patterson's reports are consistently positive." He gestured toward Sophia. "Child care emergencies happen. I'm not a monster, Mrs. Rodriguez, despite what the staff apparently believes." The last sentence was delivered with the faintest hint of something that might have been humor, though it was hard to tell with his perpetually stern expression. Maria felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, the emotional whiplash of the last few minutes finally catching up with her. She'd been prepared for the worst, for immediate termination, possibly even for police being called for trespassing or child endangerment or whatever legal trouble she'd imagined. Instead, Alexander Thornfield was offering her not just continued employment but actual help. "Thank you," she managed, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you so much, Mr. Thornfield. I promise this won't happen again. I'll make other arrangements, I'll—" He held up a hand, cutting off her gratitude. "The library, Mrs. Rodriguez. I have a conference call in 10 minutes. It was a dismissal, clear and direct. Maria nodded quickly, adjusting her grip on Sophia, who was still clutching Ella and humming her nameless tune. As Maria turned to leave, Sophia suddenly twisted in her arms and waved at Thornfield with her free hand. "Bye-bye, Dada." Maria cringed, but before she could issue another apology, she heard something that made her pause in the doorway. A sound, barely perceptible, but definitely there. Alexander Thornfield had laughed. It wasn't a full laugh, more like a brief exhalation of air that might have been amusement, but it was there nonetheless. Maria glanced back over her shoulder and caught the tail end of something that might have been a smile ghosting across his face before his features settled back into their usual stern lines. He caught her looking, and his expression hardened again immediately. "The library, Mrs. Rodriguez," he repeated, his tone brooking no further delay. Maria fled, her mind reeling as she carried Sophia through the mansion's hallways. She found the library exactly where Thornfield had indicated, a magnificent room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a rolling ladder, plush carpets, and indeed, a cushioned window seat that looked out over the estate's gardens. She settled Sophia on the window seat with her coloring books, snacks, and Ella, making sure her daughter was comfortable and safe. Sophia seemed delighted with the new space, immediately pressing her face against the window to watch a bird hopping across the lawn below. As Maria began the task of dusting and cleaning the library's many surfaces, her mind kept replaying the scene in the study. Alexander Thornfield, the cold, isolated billionaire who supposedly never let anyone close, who treated his staff like furniture, who lived like a hermit in this enormous house, had not only shown mercy but kindness. And Sophia had called him Dada. Maria glanced at her daughter, who was now talking animatedly to Ella about the bird she'd seen, creating an elaborate story in that special way 2-year-olds did, where logic and imagination blended seamlessly. What kind of man was Alexander Thornfield, really? The staff gossip painted him as heartless, but heartless men didn't offer to feed someone's child. They didn't suggest comfortable spaces for toddlers to wait. They definitely didn't laugh, even briefly, at being called Dada by a stranger's child. Maria didn't have answers, but as she worked methodically through the library, checking on Sophia every few minutes, she found herself reconsidering everything she thought she knew about the mansion's mysterious owner. Over the next 2 weeks, Maria lived in a constant state of low-level anxiety that gradually, inexplicably, began to ease. Mrs. Chen recovered from her pneumonia, but then her daughter in California had a baby and she flew out to help for a month. The backup sitter's mother fell ill. Maria's carefully constructed childcare arrangements collapsed like a house of cards, leaving her once again with no choice but to bring Sophia to work. The first time after that initial incident, Maria had shown up at the service entrance with Sophia in tow, her prepared apology already on her lips, fully expecting Mrs. Patterson to turn her away. Instead, the head housekeeper had simply nodded and said, "Mr. Thornfield left instructions. The library is available for your daughter's use on the days you work here." Maria had been stunned. She'd assumed Thornfield's tolerance had been a one-time mercy, not an ongoing arrangement. But apparently, the billionaire had actually thought ahead, had actually made provisions for a situation he had no obligation to accommodate. Now, on her 5th day of bringing Sophia to the estate, Maria had fallen into a routine. She'd set Sophia up in the library with activities and snacks, then work her way through her cleaning assignments, checking on her daughter regularly. Sophia, for her part, had adapted beautifully to the arrangement. The library had become her favorite place in the world, a magical kingdom filled with books she couldn't read yet but loved to look at, soft places to play, and most importantly, the big window where she could watch the world outside. What Maria hadn't expected was that Alexander Thornfield would start appearing in the library. The first time, Maria had been dusting the shelves while Sophia played quietly on the carpet with her toys. She'd heard the door open and turned to find Thornfield standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable as always. Maria had immediately tensed, waiting for the complaint or the reversal of his previous kindness. Instead, he'd simply walked to one of the shelves, pulled out a thick book on architecture, and left without a word. The entire interaction had taken maybe 30 seconds. But then it happened again the next day. And the day after that. Each time, Thornfield would enter the library while Maria was cleaning, select a book or retrieve some papers he'd apparently left there, and depart with minimal acknowledgement of either Maria or Sophia's presence. Except Maria began to notice things. She noticed that Thornfield always came to the library during the hour when she was working there, even though the mansion had multiple offices and living spaces where he could work. She noticed that he spent slightly longer each time, his selection of books becoming more deliberate, his movements less rushed. She noticed that while he never spoke to Sophia directly, his eyes would sometimes drift to where the little girl played, watching her for just a moment before looking away. And Sophia, with the uncanny awareness children sometimes possessed, had noticed him too. "Mama, the bookman is here," she announced one afternoon in her carrying 2-year-old voice as Thornfield entered the library. Maria winced at the title, but when she glanced at Thornfield, she caught what might have been amusement in his eyes before he turned toward the shelves. "Sophia, please play quietly, sweetheart," Maria whispered, but her daughter was already distracted by the puzzle she'd been working on. Maria went back to cleaning the windows, very aware of Thornfield's presence as he moved through the room. The library was large, but not so large that 2 adults and a toddler could exist in it without some awareness of each other. She found herself tracking his movements peripherally, the way prey might track a predator, not because she feared him exactly, but because his presence commanded attention. She was balanced on a step stool, reaching to clean the top corner of a window, when Sophia's voice rang out again. "Mama, look, a butterfly." Maria turned too quickly, forgetting she was on the stool, and felt her balance shift. Her stomach dropped as she began to fall, her arms windmilling uselessly. Strong hands caught her waist, steadying her before she hit the ground. Maria gasped, her heart hammering, and found herself looking directly into Alexander Thornfield's face from far too close. His hands were still on her waist, warm through the thin fabric of her work uniform, and his gray eyes were closer than they'd ever been. "Careful," he said quietly, the word almost gentle. Time seemed to freeze. Maria was acutely aware of every point of contact. His hands on her waist, the faint scent of his cologne, the fact that she could see tiny flecks of blue in his gray eyes that she'd never noticed before. He was so close she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Thank you," she stammered, and he released her immediately, stepping back as if the contact had burned him. "The stool is unstable," he said, his voice returning to its usual cool tone. "There are better stepladders in the utility closet. I'll have Mrs. Patterson ensure you have appropriate equipment." He left the library without another word, the door closing firmly behind him. Maria stood there for a long moment, her hand pressed against her still-racing heart. Sophia had already forgotten about the butterfly and the near fall, back to playing with her puzzle pieces. But Maria couldn't forget the feeling of Thornfield's hands on her waist, the concern she'd seen flash through his eyes, the careful way he'd steadied her. The next day, there was indeed a new stepladder waiting in the library when Maria arrived. Sturdy, stable, professional grade. And there was something else, a small basket of high-end toys and books, clearly expensive, appropriate for a toddler, sitting on the window seat. Mrs. Patterson, when Maria asked, simply shrugged. Mr. Thornfield ordered them. Said the library should have appropriate materials if it was to be used as a children's space twice a week. Maria stared at the basket, overwhelmed. These weren't just any toys. There was a deluxe wooden puzzle, several board books from that expensive educational company, plush letters that could be stuck to smooth surfaces, and a beautiful children's book about a little girl and her elephant. When Thornfield entered the library that afternoon for his now routine book selection, Maria was waiting. She'd rehearsed what she wanted to say, determined to express her gratitude properly. "Mr. Thornfield," she began as he approached one of the shelves, "I wanted to thank you for the toys and books. You didn't have to do that, but Sophia loves them, and I really appreciate." "They're for the library," he interrupted, not looking at her. "The room should be functional for its current use." "Still, Mrs. Rodriguez." He finally turned to face her, and there was something in his expression that made her words die in her throat. "Do you know why I bought this estate?" The question was so unexpected that Maria could only shake her head. "Space," he said simply. "Room to exist without having to account for anyone else's needs or feelings. Room to not be bothered." He paused, his gaze drifting to where Sophia was contentedly stacking alphabet blocks. "But space unused is just emptiness. A library with books no one reads is just a tomb for dead trees. If the room can serve a purpose, then it should." It was the most he'd ever said to her at once, and Maria sensed there were layers to his words that she didn't fully understand. Before she could formulate a response, Sophia's voice piped up. "Dada, look. I made a—" Maria's eyes widened in horror. They'd had this conversation multiple times. Sophia was not supposed to call Mr. Thornfield Dada. But her daughter, with the stubborn persistence unique to 2-year-olds, had apparently decided that the man who provided toys and books and existed in their space must be important enough to warrant the title. "Sophia, no," Maria started, moving toward her daughter. "Remember, this is Mr. Thorn." "She made an A," Thornfield said, cutting off Maria's correction. He was looking at Sophia's block tower, where she had indeed managed to arrange 2 blocks in a rough approximation of the letter A. That's good. The awkwardness of the compliment was almost painful, as if Thornfield had no experience talking to children and was making his best attempt based on theory alone. But Sophia, delighted by the attention, beamed at him. "I make be next," she announced. "Dada watch." Maria opened her mouth to correct her again, but Thornfield spoke first. "I have a conference call," he said abruptly, and left the library even more quickly than usual, the door closing with a soft click behind him. Maria sank down beside her daughter, gently taking her small hands. "Sophia, sweetheart, you can't call Mr. Thornfield Dada. He's not your daddy. He's Mama's boss." Sophia's face scrunched up in confusion. "But he's nice. He got Ella. He got toys." "I know, baby, but that doesn't make him your daddy. Your daddy is—" Maria trailed off, unsure how to explain to a 2-year-old that her father had never wanted her, had never been there, had never been the man Sophia deserved. "Don't have a daddy," Sophia said matter-of-factly, turning back to her blocks. "But the bookman is nice. Can call him bookman." "Yes," Maria agreed, relief flooding through her. "The bookman is fine." But Sophia, with the selective hearing of a toddler, seemed to have already moved on, humming to herself as she attempted to build the letter B. That evening, as Maria cleaned the study, Sophia safely back in the library with her new toys, she found a note on Thornfield's desk, written in sharp, angular handwriting on expensive stationery. "Mrs. Rodriguez, the chef has been instructed to prepare lunch for your daughter on the days you work here. Dietary restrictions should be reported to Mrs. Patterson." Maria read the note 3 times, her eyes burning with unexpected tears. Alexander Thornfield, the cold, isolated billionaire who supposedly never cared about anyone, was ensuring her daughter was fed. Not just fed, but properly. He'd even considered potential dietary restrictions. She folded the note carefully and slipped it into her pocket, a small piece of evidence that the world was more complicated than she'd thought, and people were more than their reputations suggested. 3 weeks into the new arrangement, something shifted in the Thornfield estate that even the other staff members began to notice. The mansion felt different, less like a mausoleum and more like a home. It was nothing dramatic, nothing anyone could quite put their finger on, but there was a change in the air, in the way sound carried through the halls, in the quality of the silence. Alexander Thornfield found himself doing things he couldn't quite explain. He'd always been a creature of rigid routine, his days planned down to the minute, his habits unchanging year after year. But now he discovered himself timing his work sessions to coincide with the hours Maria Rodriguez cleaned the library. He told himself it was practical. He needed books from there, after all, and documents, and the quiet space for thinking. But that didn't explain why he'd started taking his lunch in the small breakfast nook adjacent to the kitchen rather than in his usual spot in the study. It didn't explain why he'd instructed the chef to prepare child-friendly versions of whatever meal was being made, or why he'd found himself standing outside the library door on several occasions, listening to the sound of Sophia singing nonsense songs to herself. He was 40 years old, had built and sold a company worth billions, commanded respect in boardrooms across the world, and somehow a 2-year-old had disrupted his entire existence by simply existing in his space. It was Thursday afternoon, and Thornfield had finished his conference calls early. He should have been reviewing the quarterly reports his investment manager had sent, or responding to the stack of emails waiting for his attention. Instead, he found himself walking toward the library, drawn by the sound of voices, Maria speaking softly to her daughter. He paused outside the door, his hand on the handle, suddenly uncertain. This was his house. He could enter any room he wanted. But something made him hesitate, made him feel like he'd be intruding on something private. "And this one is a lion," Maria was saying. "Can you say lion, Sophia?" "Lion," Sophia repeated enthusiastically. "Big kitty." "That's right, baby. A very big kitty." Thornfield found himself smiling, actually smiling, at Sophia's description. When had he last smiled at anything? When had the simple sound of a child's voice become something that pulled him toward it rather than pushed him away? He opened the door and entered, and both Maria and Sophia looked up from where they sat on the carpet, a picture book open between them. Maria immediately started to stand, that familiar flash of anxiety crossing her face, but Thornfield waved her back down. "Don't let me interrupt," he said, moving toward the shelves where he'd stashed some business journals he'd been meaning to read. But his eyes kept drifting to the scene on the carpet. Mother and daughter, heads bent together over a book, Sophia's small hand patting the picture of a lion. "Bookman," Sophia announced, having spotted him. "Come see the big kitty." "Sophia," Maria said gently, "Mr. Thornfield is busy." "It's fine," Thornfield found himself saying. The words came out before he could think better of them, before the walls he'd spent years building could stop him. He crossed to where they sat and, after a moment's hesitation, lowered himself to sit on the carpet beside them. The action felt foreign, uncomfortable. When was the last time he'd sat on a floor? When was the last time he'd looked at a children's book? But Sophia was already scooting closer to him, dragging the book with her, completely unaware of or unconcerned by his legendary coldness. "See, big kitty," she said, pointing at the lion with one chubby finger. "He go roar." Sophia demonstrated the roar, which came out as more of a squeaky growl, and something in Thornfield's chest cracked. Not broke, cracked, like ice beginning to thaw. "That's very fearsome," he said seriously, and Sophia giggled. "You do it. You roar." Thornfield looked at Maria helplessly, completely out of his depth. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Surprise, certainly, but something else too. Curiosity, maybe, or tentative hope. "I don't think Mr. Thornfield," Maria started. "Roar," Sophia insisted, bouncing on her bottom. And Alexander Thornfield, billionaire, self-made success story, man who'd fired executives without blinking and closed multi-million-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, made a roaring sound for a 2-year-old girl. It wasn't a very good roar, too self-conscious, too quiet, but Sophia shrieked with delight anyway, clapping her hands together. "Again! Again!" "Sophia, that's enough," Maria said gently. "We shouldn't bother." "She's not bothering me." Thornfield surprised himself by meaning it. When had this happened? When had this tiny person worked her way past his defenses? He looked at Maria, really looked at her, and saw someone who was more than just his housekeeper. He saw a woman his own age who'd clearly been through hardship but faced each day with determination, who loved her daughter with a fierceness he couldn't help but admire, who worked without complaint and somehow still found the energy to read picture books on her break. "I should get back to work," Maria said, but she didn't move to stand. "I still need to clean the drawing room, and—" "Stay," Thornfield said. Another word that came out before he could stop it. "Your break isn't over yet, is it?" Maria checked her watch, clearly surprised. "No, I have another 15 minutes, but—" "Then stay." He gestured to the book. "What happens next? Does the lion eat anyone?" Sophia gasped, scandalized. "No. Lions are nice. They eat." She paused, thinking hard. "Grass." "Actually, lions eat meat," Thornfield found himself explaining. "They're carnivores, which means they eat other animals. But you're right that they're not mean. They're just being lions, doing what lions do." Sophia processed this with the seriousness of a child learning something new and important. "Oh, like how I eat chicken nuggets." "Exactly like that." Maria was staring at him now, openly surprised, and Thornfield felt heat rise to his face. Why was he sitting on a floor explaining the food chain to a toddler? What was wrong with him? But before he could make an excuse and leave, Sophia had moved on to the next page, pointing at a picture of an elephant. "Look. Like Ella." She reached for her stuffed elephant, which was never far from her side, and held it up to compare with the picture. "Same trunk. Do you know what sound elephants make?" Thornfield asked, and then immediately wondered where that question had come from. He was engaging now, actually participating in this interaction rather than just enduring it. Sophia shook her head, her eyes wide with anticipation. Thornfield made what he hoped was an elephant sound, a low trumpeting noise that made Sophia dissolve into giggles and Maria laugh, actually laugh, the sound bright and unguarded. "That was terrible," Maria said, then immediately covered her mouth, horror flooding her face. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Thornfield. I didn't mean—" "It was terrible," he agreed, surprising them both. "I have no idea what elephants actually sound like." "Like this." Sophia demonstrated her own version, which was equally inaccurate but infinitely more endearing. They continued through the book, and somehow Thornfield ended up staying for the full 15 minutes of Maria's break, and then another 15 minutes after that. Sophia showed him all her favorite pictures, explained the elaborate stories she'd created around each animal, and insisted he make the appropriate sounds for each one. Maria gradually relaxed, even contributing her own animal sounds, which were all hilariously wrong but made Sophia laugh so hard she got the hiccups. By the time Thornfield finally excused himself, nearly an hour had passed. As he left the library, he heard Sophia ask her mother, "Is the bookman coming back tomorrow?" "Maybe," Maria answered softly. "But we can't expect him to, okay? He's very busy." "He liked the animals," Sophia said confidently. "He'll come back." Thornfield closed the door and stood in the hallway, his business journals forgotten, his afternoon schedule completely abandoned. When had he last spent an hour just being present with other people? When had he last laughed at something silly and harmless? He couldn't remember. That night, alone in his bedroom, a vast space decorated in blacks and grays that suddenly seemed depressing rather than sophisticated, Thornfield couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Sophia's laugh, about Maria's smile, about how warm the library had felt with the two of them in it. He'd built this estate as a fortress against the world after his parents died. No more loss, no more pain, no more vulnerability. If he never let anyone close, they couldn't leave him. If he never cared about anyone, he couldn't be destroyed by their absence. But somehow, a 28-year-old single mother and her 2-year-old daughter had slipped past his defenses without him even noticing until it was too late. The next morning, Thornfield found himself actually looking forward to Thursday afternoon, Maria's next scheduled workday. When the day finally arrived, he abandoned any pretense of accidentally timing his library visits. Instead, he simply showed up during Sophia's morning playtime. "Bookman." Sophia greeted him, now completely comfortable with his presence. "I drawed you a picture." She thrust a piece of paper at him, a chaotic mess of crayon scribbles that might have been anything or nothing. "It's very—" Thornfield searched for the right word, colorful. Sophia beamed. "It's you. And Mama. And me. And Ella." Thornfield looked closer at the scribbles and realized there were indeed 4 distinct blobs in different colors. His blob was black, of course. Maria's was blue. Sophia's was pink. And Ella the elephant was gray. "Thank you," he said, and meant it. "I'll put it in my office." Maria, who was watching this exchange with barely concealed amazement, said, "You don't have to." "I want to." Thornfield carefully folded the drawing and slipped it into his pocket. He had a wall of original artwork in his office, paintings worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, but somehow this crayon scribble felt more valuable than all of them combined. And in that moment, standing in the library with Maria staring at him in wonder and Sophia humming happily as she started another masterpiece, Alexander Thornfield realized something terrifying. He was happy. For the first time in years, maybe decades, he was genuinely, simply happy. And he had no idea what to do with that feeling. The trouble started on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in late March. Maria had been cleaning the second-floor hallway when she'd heard shouting from downstairs. Male voices, angry and aggressive, and the sound of the front door slamming open. Her immediate thought was Sophia, alone in the library, and her blood had turned to ice. She'd run toward the library, her heart pounding, but before she could reach it, she'd nearly collided with Alexander Thornfield in the hallway. He'd grabbed her shoulders, stopping her momentum, his face set in harder lines than she'd seen in weeks. "Stay here," he'd commanded. "Keep your daughter quiet and stay in the library with the door locked until I come get you." "What's happening?" Maria had whispered, but Thornfield was already gone, taking the stairs down 2 at a time. Maria had rushed to the library to find Sophia blissfully unaware, still playing with her alphabet blocks. She'd locked the door as instructed and gathered her daughter close, straining to hear what was happening below. The voices had carried up through the mansion's acoustics, angry, accusatory, threatening. She'd caught fragments, "Owe us," and "Can't hide," and "Make you pay." There had been crashes, the sound of furniture being overturned, and through it all, Thornfield's voice, cold and commanding, though she couldn't make out his words. Then sirens. Police arriving. More raised voices, then the sounds of people being forcibly removed from the property. It had taken 45 minutes before Thornfield had knocked on the library door. Mrs. Rodriguez, you can unlock it now. They're gone. Maria had opened the door to find him standing there, his perfect composure restored, though his shirt was slightly rumpled and there was a red mark on his cheekbone that would probably bruise. "Are you hurt?" she'd asked before she could stop herself. "I'm fine." His tone had been clipped, back to the cold distance of their first months. "You should take the rest of the day off. With pay," he'd added. "Take your daughter and go home." "Mr. Thornfield, what happened? Who were those men?" "No one you need to concern yourself with." He'd already been turning away. "Mrs. Patterson will call you about next week's schedule." That had been 3 days ago, and Maria hadn't been back to the estate since. Mrs. Patterson had called to say that Mr. Thornfield was dealing with some business matters and the house didn't need cleaning that week. Maria should stay home, still with pay, and they'd call when services were needed again. Now, sitting in her tiny apartment on a Friday evening while Sophia played with the toys Thornfield had bought her, Maria couldn't shake the worry that had taken root in her chest. What had happened? Who were those men? And why was she more concerned about Alexander Thornfield than about the loss of a week's work? She knew the answer, even if she didn't want to admit it. Somewhere along the way, she'd started to care about the cold billionaire who'd shown her daughter kindness. She'd started to look forward to those moments in the library, to the sound of his laugh when Sophia made him participate in her games, to the way his stern expression would soften when he didn't think anyone was watching. She'd started to see the man behind the walls, and that man was lonely, wounded, and trying so hard to protect himself from more pain that he'd isolated himself completely. And now something had threatened him, and she didn't know if he was safe. "Mama, why you sad?" Sophia asked, looking up from where she was giving Ella a pretend tea party. "I'm not sad, baby," Maria lied. "Just thinking. About the book man." Maria's heart clenched. Of course Sophia had noticed. 2-year-olds noticed everything. "Yeah, about the book man. He's nice," Sophia said confidently. "He'll come back." Maria wished she had her daughter's certainty. The call came Sunday evening, 2 days later than expected. But it wasn't Mrs. Patterson on the line. It was Alexander Thornfield himself. "Mrs. Rodriguez." His voice was formal, distant. "I apologize for the disruption to your schedule. If you're available, I'd like you to return to work on Monday. Your regular hours." "Of course, Mr. Thornfield." "I'm glad." Maria paused, unsure what she could say. "I'm glad you're okay. I was worried about you." Both felt too personal, too revealing of feelings she had no right to have. "I'm glad the schedule is back to normal." There was silence on the line, stretching long enough that Maria wondered if he'd hung up. Then, "Mrs. Rodriguez, on Monday, would you be bringing Sophia?" The question was awkward, almost hesitant, so unlike his usual commanding tone that Maria's breath caught. "If that's still okay? I know with everything that happened." "It's okay," he said quickly. "More than okay. I just wanted to know. For the chef. For planning lunch." "Oh, yes, she'll be with me." Another pause. "Good. That's good. I'll see you Monday, then." He hung up before Maria could respond, leaving her staring at her phone in confusion and something that felt dangerously like hope. Monday morning, Maria approached the estate with Sophia chattering excitedly about seeing her library again. The mansion looked exactly the same from the outside, but when they entered through the service entrance, Maria noticed things were different. There were new locks on the doors. A security camera had been installed in the hallway. And when she made her way to the library, she found Thornfield already there, sitting in one of the leather chairs with a book open in his lap, though she suspected he hadn't been reading. He stood when they entered. "Mrs. Rodriguez." "Sophia." "Bookman." Sophia rushed toward him without hesitation, and Maria's heart stopped. But Thornfield didn't step back or retreat behind his walls. Instead, he crouched down to Sophia's level, accepting her enthusiastic hug with an awkwardness that was somehow endearing. "I missed you," Sophia announced. "Mama missed you too." Maria felt heat flood her face. "Sophia, that's—" "I missed you both as well," Thornfield said quietly, interrupting what would have been Maria's embarrassed denial. He stood, his gray eyes meeting Maria's directly. "Could we talk? Privately?" Maria's stomach dropped. This was it, The conversation where he explained that the situation had become too complicated, that having Sophia at the estate was no longer feasible, that Maria's services were no longer needed. She'd been expecting it, dreading it, knowing it had to come. "Sophia, sweetheart, can you play with your toys for a few minutes while Mama talks to Mr. Thornfield?" Sophia, already distracted by her alphabet blocks, waved them away cheerfully. Maria followed Thornfield to the far corner of the library, near the windows overlooking the gardens. He stood with his back to her for a moment, his posture rigid, and she braced herself for the blow. "The men who came here last week," he began without preamble, "were criminals. Associates of a former business partner who went to prison for fraud 3 years ago. They blamed me for his conviction, claimed I owed them money for their losses. They've been harassing me for months, letters, phone calls, increasingly aggressive threats." Maria listened in shocked silence. "I thought I could handle it through legal channels," Thornfield continued. "Restraining orders, police reports, the proper procedures. But they escalated. Showed up at my home. Threatened violence." He finally turned to face her, and Maria saw something raw in his expression. "They could have hurt you. Or Sophia. You were here, in my house, and I'd put you in danger without even thinking about it." "Mr. Thornfield." "Alexander," he said. "After everything, I think you can call me Alexander." Maria's breath caught. "Alexander," she repeated, the name feeling strange on her tongue. "What happened wasn't your fault. Wasn't it?" His laugh was bitter. "I should have increased security weeks ago. I should have taken the threats more seriously. I should have—" He broke off, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "I've spent so many years pushing everyone away, convinced that if I never let anyone close, I could never hurt anyone or be hurt myself. But that Tuesday, all I could think about was that Sophia was in this house, and if something happened to her, if those men hurt that little girl because of my past." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Maria understood. "We're okay," she said softly. "We're both okay. And you protected us. You kept us safe. This time." Alexander's jaw tightened. "But I can't guarantee there won't be a next time. My life, my business, my past, they come with complications. With threats. With dangers that a housekeeper and her daughter shouldn't be exposed to." Here it comes, Maria thought. The dismissal. The end of this impossible, complicated situation they'd all stumbled into. "So I've made some changes," Alexander continued. "I've hired a full security team. The estate now has 24-hour surveillance. Anyone who enters the property will be thoroughly vetted. And I've worked with my lawyers to ensure that the people who threatened us can't come within 1,000 yards of this house." Maria blinked. "I don't understand." "I'm making it safe," Alexander said, and there was something almost desperate in his voice. "I'm making sure that you and Sophia can be here without risk. Because—" He paused, seemed to struggle with the words, "because I can't go back to how it was before. The empty house, the silence, the walls I'd built so high I'd forgotten what sunlight felt like. I can't do it anymore." He took a step closer, and Maria's heart started beating faster. "These past weeks, with you both here, have been the first time I've felt alive in years. The first time I've wanted to come home instead of staying away as long as possible. The first time I've looked forward to tomorrow instead of just enduring it." "Alexander," Maria whispered, overwhelmed by the confession. "I know it's complicated," he continued. "I'm your employer. There are power dynamics and ethical considerations and a dozen reasons why this is inappropriate. But I need you to know that you and Sophia are not just employees or inconveniences or obligations. You've become—" He seemed to search for the right word, "important. Both of you. More important than I ever intended to let anyone become." From across the library, Sophia's voice called out, "Mama! Bookman! Come see. I made all the letters." They both turned to look at the little girl, who was standing proudly beside a crooked line of alphabet blocks, beaming with accomplishment. "We should—" Maria gestured toward Sophia, unable to finish the sentence because her throat had closed up with emotion. They crossed to where Sophia waited, and Alexander crouched down to examine her work. "This is very impressive," he said seriously. All 26 letters. I'm smart, Sophia announced. You are indeed. Sophia threw her arms around his neck in another spontaneous hug, and this time Alexander didn't hesitate before returning it, his large hands gentle as they patted her small back. Maria watched them, her vision blurring with tears she didn't dare let fall, and realized that everything had changed. They'd crossed some invisible line, stepped into territory that was complicated and potentially heartbreaking, but also filled with possibility. "Alexander," she said softly, and he looked up at her, Sophia still in his arms. "Thank you. For everything. For trusting us with this. With you." His expression softened in that way she'd started to recognize, the thawing of ice, the cracking of walls built over years of isolation and fear. "Come on, Sophia," he said, standing up with her in his arms as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "Let's go have lunch and see if we can make the alphabet with our food." "With chicken nuggets?" Sophia asked hopefully. "With anything you want." As they left the library together, Alexander carrying Sophia, Maria walking beside them, something settled in Maria's chest. It wasn't quite security, and it certainly wasn't simplicity, but it was real. It was honest. And it was, against all odds, starting to feel like family. Summer came to Chicago with a gentleness that surprised everyone. The gardens at the Thornfield estate bloomed in riots of color, and Sophia spent hours at the library window pointing out every flower, every bird, every cloud that drifted by. She'd be 3 soon, her vocabulary expanding daily, her observations becoming more complex and hilarious. "Bookman, why is the sky sad today?" she'd asked Alexander one gray morning in June. "The sky isn't sad," he'd answered, looking up from the quarterly reports he'd been pretending to read. "Why do you think it's sad?" "'Cause it's crying," Sophia had explained, pointing at the rain streaming down the windows. "Like when I'm sad, I cry." Alexander had considered this seriously. Maybe the sky is happy. Maybe the rain is like when you laugh so hard you cry. Sophia had thought about this, her little face scrunched in concentration. "Okay. The sky is laugh-crying." That conversation had taken place 3 months ago, and Alexander still thought about it sometimes. The idea that tears could come from joy as well as sadness, that crying wasn't always a sign of pain. It was such a simple concept, something a 2-year-old understood instinctively, but he'd forgotten it somewhere along the way. Now, standing in the library on a Thursday afternoon in August, Alexander watched Maria help Sophia unwrap birthday presents. The entire household staff had contributed. Mrs. Patterson had gotten a beautiful dress, the chef had made a princess cake with 3 candles, the gardener had given her a small watering can so she could help with the flowers. Alexander's own gift sat in the center of the pile, a custom-made bookshelf for Sophia's room, scaled to her size and painted in cheerful colors, already assembled and waiting to be filled. "It's too much," Maria had said when she'd seen it, but there were tears in her eyes that Alexander had learned to recognize as the happy kind. "It's not enough," he'd replied honestly. "How did you quantify the value of someone who'd taught you how to live again? How to laugh again? How to want to wake up in the morning?" The past 4 months had transformed the estate in ways that went beyond the physical security upgrades. The chef now prepared family-style meals that Alexander ate at the kitchen table instead of alone in the dining room. The library had become a central hub rather than a dusty monument to books no one read. There were toys scattered in corners, Sophia's artwork hung on his office walls, and the house rang with the sound of her laughter at least twice a week. And Maria had become the center of Alexander's existence in a way he'd never intended but couldn't imagine reversing. It hadn't been easy. There were complications, ethical considerations, and moments where Alexander second-guessed everything. Maria still worked for the cleaning service technically, though Alexander had been paying her directly for months now, with a salary that reflected her value to him rather than standard housekeeping rates. He'd offered to set her up in one of the estate's guest houses, but she'd declined, wanting to maintain some independence, some sense that this wasn't charity. They'd danced around their feelings for months, both aware that something profound had shifted between them but neither willing to name it. Until one night in July when Alexander had found Maria crying in the kitchen after she'd gotten a letter from her landlord raising her rent by an amount she couldn't possibly afford. He'd offered her money. She'd refused. They'd argued, with real emotion and frustration and honesty, and somewhere in that argument, Alexander had said the words that had been building in his chest for months. "Because I love you." The silence after that confession had stretched for an eternity. Maria had stared at him, tears still wet on her cheeks, and Alexander had realized what he'd done. He'd crossed the line, put his feelings out in the open where they could be examined and potentially rejected. "You can't," Maria had whispered. "I'm your employee. I'm a single mother with a toddler. I work for a cleaning service. You're a billionaire who—" "I don't care about any of that," Alexander had interrupted. "I care about you. About Sophia. About the fact that for the first time in 20 years, this house feels like a home. About the fact that I look forward to Thursdays and Mondays because I know you'll both be here. About the fact that when Sophia calls me bookman or dada, I don't want to correct her anymore because maybe that's who I want to be." Maria had closed the distance between them then, had reached up to cup his face in her hands, those hands that he'd once thought were just tools for cleaning but that he now knew were capable of such gentle strength, and had kissed him. It had been tentative at first, questioning, but when Alexander had pulled her closer, deepened the kiss, it had become something more. A promise, maybe, or a beginning. They'd taken things slowly after that, navigating the complications of their situation with care. Maria had officially quit the cleaning service, and Alexander had hired her as Sophia's nanny, a position that came with a generous salary, benefits, and the guest house she'd previously refused. It wasn't perfect, and there were still power dynamics to navigate, but it was honest. It was real. Now, watching Sophia blow out her birthday candles with Maria's help, making a wish that she loudly announced was for a puppy and more crayons, Alexander felt something he'd thought he'd lost forever after his parents died: belonging. "Make a wish, Mama," Sophia insisted after she'd blown out her candles. "I don't need to, baby," Maria said, her eyes meeting Alexander's across the cake. "I already have everything I could wish for." Later that evening, after Sophia had been tucked into bed in the guest house, which had been completely redecorated to suit a 3-year-old's tastes, Maria and Alexander sat in the library together. It had become their space, the room where everything had started, where walls had come down and hearts had opened. "I have something for you," Alexander said, pulling out an envelope he'd been carrying all day. Maria opened it curiously, then froze as she read the contents. "Alexander, this is a trust fund for Sophia's education," he finished. "Fully funded, enough to cover everything from preschool through graduate school if she wants it." "I can't accept this," Maria said, but her hands were shaking as she held the papers. "It's too much, It's her future," Alexander said firmly. "I'm not her biological father, I know that. But Maria, I want to be her father in all the ways that matter. I want to be there for her school plays and her scraped knees and her first heartbreak. I want to teach her to be strong and kind and to know she's loved unconditionally. I want," he paused, reaching for Maria's hand, "I want to be your family. Both of you. If you'll let me." Maria was crying now, the happy kind of tears that Sophia had tried to explain. "You already are," she whispered. "You have been for months. We're already your family, Alexander. We're already home." He pulled her close, buried his face in her hair, and let himself feel the fullness of it, the love, the belonging, the future stretching out ahead of them. "Mama." "Bookman." Sophia's sleepy voice called from the doorway. Neither of them had heard her get out of bed. "Can't sleep. Bad dream." Alexander and Maria separated, and without discussion, they both held out their arms. Sophia ran to them, scrambling up onto the sofa between them, and curled against Alexander's chest while reaching for Maria's hand. "What was your dream about, sweetheart?" Maria asked gently. "You went away," Sophia mumbled, already half asleep again. "But then I woke up and you're still here." "We're still here," Alexander confirmed, adjusting so Sophia was comfortable against him. "We're not going anywhere. Promise." "Promise," Alexander and Maria said together. Sophia sighed contentedly and within minutes was asleep again, her breathing deep and even. Maria started to shift, probably intending to carry her back to bed, but Alexander shook his head. "Let her stay," he said quietly. "Just for a little while." So they sat there in the library as twilight deepened into night, the three of them together in the space where a cold, isolated man had first encountered a desperate mother and her innocent daughter. The room where walls had come down, where hearts had opened, where a family had formed from the most unlikely pieces. Outside, the summer night was perfect, warm and clear, with stars beginning to appear one by one in the darkening sky. The estate that had been a fortress, a prison of Alexander's own making, had transformed into something else entirely. It was filled with laughter now, with Sophia's drawings and Maria's warmth and the possibility of tomorrows that didn't feel like sentences to be endured but gifts to be celebrated. "Alexander," Maria said softly, careful not to wake Sophia. Thank you for letting us in. For taking the chance. For loving us." He looked down at Sophia's peaceful face, then over at Maria's gentle smile, and felt that crack in his chest widen into something vast and warm and terrifying and wonderful. "Thank you for seeing past the walls," he replied. "For teaching me that letting people in isn't weakness, it's the bravest thing you can do. For showing me that family isn't just about blood or obligation. It's about choice. About showing up. About love." Maria leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence, the three of them forming a picture of something neither Maria nor Alexander had thought possible just months ago. A family, imperfect and unconventional, but real and whole and theirs. In the weeks and months that followed, life continued its gentle transformation of the Thornfield estate. Sophia started preschool at an excellent private school where she charmed teachers and made friends with the same ease she'd brought to charming a billionaire. Maria enrolled in online classes, working toward the degree she'd had to abandon when she got pregnant, discovering a passion for early childhood education. And Alexander, the man who'd thought he was broken beyond repair, found himself learning how to build a life instead of just surviving one. They had their struggles, adjusting to living together, navigating the complexities of blending their lives, dealing with the inevitable gossip that came with their unconventional relationship. But they faced it all together, this unlikely family that had formed in a library over picture books and alphabet blocks. And sometimes, on quiet Thursday afternoons, Alexander would find himself in that same library with Sophia, now reading chapter books instead of picture books, and he'd remember the first time she'd called him Dada. He'd been so uncomfortable with it then, so determined to maintain distance, so convinced that caring was a weakness he couldn't afford. Now, when Sophia called him Dad, no longer Dada or Bookman, but simply, confidently, Dad, he felt only gratitude. Gratitude for the poorly maid who'd been desperate enough to bring her daughter to work, for the 2-year-old who'd refused to accept his walls, for the chance at redemption and love and family that he'd never thought he'd have. The Thornfield estate, once a monument to isolation and fear, had become exactly what it was always meant to be, a home. Not because of its marble floors or priceless art or sprawling grounds, but because it was filled with love and laughter and the beautiful chaos of a family choosing each other, day after day after day. And in his office, hanging in a place of honor above his desk where he saw it every day, was a faded crayon drawing, 4 blobs in black, blue, pink, and gray. A family, drawn by a 2-year-old who'd seen what was possible before any of the adults had figured it out. Sometimes the best things in life came not from careful planning or calculated risks, but from moments of desperation that turned into miracles. From a poor maid taking her daughter to work, from a cold man learning to love again, from a little girl brave enough to call a stranger Dada, and wise enough to know that sometimes the heart recognizes home before the mind catches up. This was their story, imperfect, unconventional, and absolutely, perfectly real. A family forged not from blood or circumstance, but from choice and courage and the kind of love that transforms everything it touches. And they lived not in a fairy tale ending where everything was perfect, but in something better, a real life, with real challenges and real joys, where every day was an opportunity to choose each other again, to build their family stronger, to prove that love, real, deep, transformative love, could heal even the most broken of hearts. The end.